Eleanor Whitmore stood at the window of her small boarding room, watching the busy street below. Her fingers traced the edges of a worn letter that had arrived 3 days ago. The paper felt rough under her touch, and the words inside had turned her world upside down. At 23, Eleanor had never imagined she would be in this situation. Her father's sudden death 6 months ago had left her with nothing but debts and the cold reality that women had few choices in 1887. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Henderson, had been patient, but patience didn't pay the bills. "Eleanor, dear, you have another visitor," Mrs. Henderson called from downstairs. Eleanor's heart sank. She knew exactly who it was and what he wanted to discuss. She walked down the creaking stairs, her brown dress rustling softly. In the small parlor sat Mr. Jameson, a thin man with sharp eyes who made his living arranging marriages between desperate women and lonely men out west. He had visited twice before, each time more insistent than the last. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising from his chair, "I trust you've had time to consider my proposal." Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Mr. Jameson, I appreciate your services, but I'm still not certain this is the right path for me." Mr. Jameson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My dear girl, let's be practical. You have no family, no inheritance, and no prospects here in Boston. I have 3 gentlemen who would be delighted to have a wife of your refinement." He pulled out 3 photographs from his leather case. "This is Mr. Hutchins. He owns a general store in Nebraska. Very prosperous, though he's looking for his 3rd wife. The previous 2, well, frontier life can be challenging." Eleanor's stomach turned, but she forced herself to look at the photograph. Mr. Hutchins looked older than her father had been, with hard eyes and a stern mouth. "Then we have Mr. Garrett," Mr. Jameson continued, placing another photo on the small table. "He runs a successful mining operation in Colorado. He's specifically requested a quiet, obedient wife who won't ask too many questions about his business." The second photograph showed a younger man, but something about his expression made Eleanor uncomfortable. She had heard stories about mining towns and the kind of men who thrived there. "And finally," Mr. Jameson said with obvious pride, "we have Mr. Thomas Brennan. He owns a cattle ranch in Montana Territory. Large spread, very successful. He's only 31 and has never been married." "This is quite an opportunity, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor picked up the 3rd photograph with trembling fingers. Unlike the other 2 men, Thomas Brennan looked different. His eyes seemed kind, though serious. He had dark hair and a strong jaw, and he wasn't smiling, but he didn't look cruel either. "Mr. Brennan has some unusual requests," Mr. Jameson continued. "He wants to correspond with his potential bride before making any final arrangements. He's willing to pay for travel expenses both ways, which means if things don't work out, you can return to Boston at no cost to yourself." This surprised Eleanor. Most arrangements she had heard about were final once the woman stepped off the train. "What kind of correspondence?" she asked quietly. "Letters, my dear. He wants to know about your interests, your thoughts, your dreams. Quite romantic, really, though somewhat impractical." Mr. Jameson's tone suggested he didn't approve of such sentimentality. Eleanor stared at the photograph. Thomas Brennan stood next to a fence with rolling hills visible in the background. There were horses nearby, and the sky looked endless. It was so different from the crowded, sooty streets of Boston. "I need more time to think," Eleanor said finally. Mr. Jameson's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Miss Whitmore, I must be frank. Your situation grows more desperate by the day. Mrs. Henderson has been asking about your rent, and winter is coming. These opportunities won't wait forever." After he left, Eleanor climbed back to her room and sat on her narrow bed. She opened her small wooden box and took out the few precious items she had left of her old life. There was her mother's locket, a book of poetry her father had given her, and a small painting she had done of the garden behind their old house. She had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, maybe even traveling to see the world. But those dreams seemed foolish now. Reality was harsh, and she was running out of options. That evening, she wrote a letter to her only friend, Mary, who had married a shopkeeper the previous year. "Dearest Mary," she began, "I hope this letter finds you and James well. I must confess I'm facing a decision that frightens me more than I can express. A marriage broker has presented me with 3 potential husbands, all living in the Western Territories. The thought of marrying a stranger terrifies me, but staying here seems impossible. She described each of the three men, spending the most time writing about Thomas Brennan. There is something about him that seems different from the others. Perhaps it is foolish, but when I look at his photograph, I don't see the hardness that shows in the other men's faces. Mr. Jameson says he wants to exchange letters first. Is it wrong to hope that this might mean he cares about more than just having someone to cook and clean for him? Eleanor sealed the letter and decided to wait for Mary's response before making her final decision. But deep in her heart, she already knew what she would choose. The alternative was slow starvation or worse, and at least with Thomas Brennan, there seemed to be a small chance for something better. She looked out her window at the gray Boston sky and tried to imagine what it would be like to see those endless Montana skies every day. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. 3 days later, Mary's response arrived. "Dear Eleanor," it read, "follow your heart but be practical too. This Mr. Brennan sounds like your best option. If he truly wants to know you through letters first, perhaps he is a man who values a woman's mind as well as her domestic skills. Sometimes we must take great risks to find great happiness." That afternoon, Eleanor knocked on Mr. Jameson's door and told him she was ready to begin correspondence with Thomas Brennan. Her hand shook as she signed the papers, but she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a tiny spark of hope. Eleanor's first letter to Thomas Brennan sat on her small desk for 2 days before she found the courage to mail it. She had written it 3 times, each version different from the last. The first had been too formal, the second too revealing, and the third felt just right. "Dear Mr. Brennan," she had finally written, "Mr. Jameson has told me of your interest in correspondence before making any arrangements. I find this both thoughtful and somewhat unusual, which gives me hope that you might be different from what I expected." She had told him about her love of books, her small paintings, and her dream of seeing the world beyond Boston's narrow streets. She mentioned her father's death and her current circumstances, but tried not to sound pitiful. Most importantly, she had been honest about her fears. "I must confess, the idea of traveling so far to marry someone I've never met frightens me greatly, but I hope that through our letters we might come to know each other well enough that this fear will lessen." 2 weeks passed before his reply arrived. Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. His handwriting was clear and strong, not at all like the scratchy writing she had expected from a rancher. "Dear Miss Whitmore," the letter began, "your honesty in speaking of your fears impressed me greatly. I want you to know that I share them. The idea of asking a woman to leave everything familiar and join me in this wild country weighs heavily on my conscience. But loneliness is a powerful force, and I find myself hoping we might be companions as well as husband and wife." Eleanor's heart quickened as she read on. Thomas wrote about his ranch, describing the vast grasslands and the way the mountains looked purple in the evening light. He told her about his cattle, his horses, and the small house he had built with his own hands. "It's not fancy," he wrote, "but it's solid and warm, with windows that look out on the most beautiful view God ever created. There's a room that gets morning sun that I always thought would make a perfect place for painting, if a person were so inclined." The fact that he remembered her interest in painting made Eleanor smile for the first time in weeks. His letter continued with questions about her life. What books did she enjoy? What did she think about when she couldn't sleep? Did she like animals? Had she ever ridden a horse? Eleanor spent hours crafting her response. She told him about her favorite novel, Jane Eyre, and how she admired the heroine's strength and independence. She admitted she had never ridden a horse but had always wanted to learn. She described the small garden her mother had kept and how she missed the smell of roses and lavender. "I think about freedom when I cannot sleep," she wrote. "Not the freedom to do whatever I please, but the freedom to be myself without apology. Does that make sense to you?" His second letter arrived more quickly than the first. "Dear Eleanor," he wrote, using her first name for the first time. "Your words about freedom make perfect sense to me. Out here, a person has room to breathe, to think, to become who they're meant to be. I hope you would find that here." Thomas began sharing more personal details in his letters. He told her about losing his parents to fever when he was 25, and how he had used his small inheritance to buy land in Montana Territory. He described the hard work of building a ranch from nothing, the lonely nights, and the satisfaction of watching his herd grow year by year. "I won't lie to you," he wrote in his third letter. "Life here is not easy. The winters are harsh, and sometimes we don't see other people for weeks at a time. But there's something about this land that gets into your blood. Every sunrise is like a gift, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own thoughts clearly for the first time. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his letters with growing excitement. Each one revealed more of his character, and she began to feel she was getting to know a real person rather than just a name on a marriage contract. In her fourth letter, she decided to be completely honest about her fears. "Dear Thomas," she wrote, "I must tell you that the stories I hear about mail-order brides frighten me terribly. I have heard of women who were treated as little more than servants or worse. I know you have no reason to make promises to someone you've never met, but I need to know what kind of life you envision for a wife." His response came faster than any previous letter. "Dear Eleanor," he wrote, "your question is fair and important. I want a partner, not a servant. I want someone to share my thoughts with at the end of the day, someone who might help me see things differently, someone who would make this house feel like a home. I have managed alone for 6 years, so I don't need someone just to cook and clean. I need someone to live with, not just someone to work for me." He went on to describe his vision of marriage as a partnership. "I believe a husband and wife should respect each other's thoughts and feelings. I would never expect you to give up everything that makes you who you are. If anything, I hope marriage would help us both become more than we could be alone." Eleanor read that letter so many times she nearly wore the paper thin. This was not what she had expected from a rough cattle rancher. His words spoke of education, sensitivity, and a loneliness that matched her own. As autumn turned to winter in Boston, their correspondence grew more frequent and more intimate. Thomas sent her a pressed wildflower from his land, and Eleanor sent him a small watercolor painting of a sunset she had painted from memory. He told her about his favorite horse, a mare named Star, and his plans to expand the ranch. She shared her memories of her parents and her dreams of seeing the world. In November, Thomas wrote the letter that would change everything. "Dear Eleanor," it began, "I have a proposal that goes beyond what Mr. Jameson originally arranged. I would like you to come to Montana in the spring, not as my bride, but as my guest. Stay for 3 months. Get to know the land, get to know me, and let me get to know you. If at the end of that time we both feel we would suit each other, then we can marry. If not, I will pay for your return to Boston and enough money to help you start fresh somewhere new. What do you say?" Eleanor's hand shook as she read the letter. This was not what she had expected at all. He was offering her a choice, a real choice, with no pressure and no trap. It was more than anyone had offered her since her father died. That night she wrote back immediately, "Dear Thomas, yes, I accept your generous proposal. I will come to Montana in the spring." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt truly hopeful about her future. The train journey to Montana Territory took 4 days, and with each mile that passed, Eleanor's nervousness grew stronger. She pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape change from the familiar forests and towns of the east to the endless grasslands of the frontier. The sky seemed bigger than anything she had ever imagined. Thomas had sent detailed instructions about the journey, along with money for meals and a private compartment. His latest letter was tucked safely in her reticule, read so many times she had memorized every word. "Don't worry about recognizing me," he had written. "I'll be the nervous-looking rancher holding his hat and probably pacing back and forth on the platform. I'll know you by your blue traveling dress and the small painting case you mentioned. I confess I'm more anxious about this meeting than I was about my first cattle drive." When the train finally pulled into the small station in Bozeman, Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she was sure other passengers could hear it. She gathered her few belongings and made her way to the door, taking deep breaths to calm herself. The platform was not crowded, which made spotting Thomas easy. He stood near the station house, indeed holding his hat and looking as nervous as she felt. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin. When he saw her step down from the train, his face broke into a smile that transformed his serious features completely. "Miss Whitmore," he said, approaching with long strides. "Eleanor?" "Yes," she replied, suddenly feeling shy. "You must be Thomas." "I am." He stopped a few feet away, as if unsure whether to offer his hand or maintain a proper distance. "How was your journey?" "You must be tired. It was long but fascinating. I've never seen country like this." Eleanor looked around at the wide streets and low buildings, with the mountains rising in the distance like purple giants. "Wait until you see the ranch," Thomas said. his nervousness seeming to ease slightly. "Here, let me take your bags. The wagon's just over there." As they walked toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two brown horses, Eleanor noticed how people nodded respectfully to Thomas. Several called out greetings, and their curious glances at Eleanor were friendly rather than suspicious. "Everyone's wondering about the woman who's been getting Thomas Brennan's letters," said a cheerful voice behind them. They turned to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands approaching. "Eleanor, this is Mrs. Campbell," Thomas said. "She runs the bakery and knows everyone's business before they do." Mrs. Campbell laughed. "Don't listen to him, dear. I just like to keep track of my friends. Thomas has been walking around here for months looking like a man with something important on his mind. Now I can see why." Eleanor felt herself blushing but was touched by the warmth in the woman's voice. "You'll have to come by the bakery while you're visiting," Mrs. Campbell continued. "I make the best apple pie in the territory and I'm dying to hear about life back east." The wagon ride to Thomas's ranch took an hour, and Eleanor was grateful for the time to adjust to his presence. He pointed out landmarks along the way and told her about his neighbors, most of whom lived miles apart but formed a close-knit community. "That's the Henderson place," he said, indicating a distant cluster of buildings. "They have 3 daughters who are about your age. I thought you might enjoy meeting them." Eleanor appreciated that he was thinking about her need for female companionship. It was another sign that he understood what a big change this would be for her. When they finally reached his ranch, Eleanor gasped in surprise. Thomas had been modest in his letters. The house was larger than she had expected, built of logs but with glass windows and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There were several outbuildings, including a barn that looked newly built, and corrals that held more horses than she could count. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, and meant it. The house sat in a valley with hills rising on all sides and a creek ran nearby, lined with cottonwood trees. "Come on," Thomas said, climbing down from the wagon. "Let me show you inside." The interior of the house surprised Eleanor even more than the outside. The rooms were spacious and well-furnished, with a large stone fireplace dominating the main room. Books lined shelves along one wall, and Eleanor noticed several that she had mentioned enjoying in her letters. "The room I mentioned for painting is through here," Thomas said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a sunny room with windows on 2 walls and a view of the mountains. "I wasn't sure what kind of supplies you might need, but I got what I could from town." Eleanor stepped into the room and saw a wooden easel, brushes, paints, and canvases arranged neatly on a table. Her throat tightened with emotion. No one had ever done something so thoughtful for her. "Thomas, this is... I don't know what to say. Thank you. I hoped you'd be able to paint the country out here," he said quietly. "It changes every day with the light and the weather. I thought an artist would find plenty to interest her." They stood there for a moment, both feeling the weight of this first real meeting after months of letters. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "I should show you to your room," he said. "You must want to rest and freshen up. I had Mrs. Henderson, that's Jim Henderson's wife, come over and prepare everything. She's left some food for supper, too, so you don't have to worry about cooking tonight." Eleanor's room was comfortable and private, with a window that looked out over the creek. Someone had placed wildflowers in a jar on the dresser, and there were clean towels and a pitcher of water for washing. "I'll be outside tending to the horses," Thomas said from the doorway. "Take all the time you need. When you're ready, come find me and I'll show you around the rest of the place." After he left, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. Thomas was exactly as he had seemed in his letters, kind, thoughtful, and respectful. But seeing him in person made everything feel more real and somehow more overwhelming. She unpacked her few belongings and changed into a simpler dress, then went to find Thomas. She discovered him in the barn, grooming a beautiful black horse with white markings on her face. "This is Star," he said when he saw Eleanor approaching. "The one I wrote to you about." Eleanor had never been this close to such a large animal, but something about Star's gentle eyes made her brave enough to reach out and touch the horse's neck. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said, "and so soft. Would you like to try riding her tomorrow?" Thomas asked. "She's very gentle, perfect for someone learning." "I'd like that very much." As the sun began to set, Thomas showed Eleanor around the ranch, explaining his plans for expansion and introducing her to the other horses. His enthusiasm for his work was obvious, and Eleanor found herself caught up in his vision for the future. That evening, they sat on the porch after supper, watching the stars appear in the vast sky. The silence was comfortable rather than awkward, and Eleanor realized that the man she had come to know through letters was exactly who Thomas really was. "I'm glad you came," Thomas said quietly. "So am I," Eleanor replied, and for the first time since leaving Boston, she truly meant it. Eleanor's first week at the ranch passed like a dream. Each morning she woke to the sound of birds singing and the distant lowing of cattle, so different from the clattering carriages and shouting vendors of Boston. Thomas had been true to his word about teaching her to ride, and under his patient guidance, she had progressed from clutching Star's mane in terror to actually enjoying the gentle motion of the horse's walk. "You're a natural," Thomas said on her 5th day, watching as she guided Star around the corral without his help. "Most people take weeks to feel comfortable on horseback." Eleanor glowed with pride at his praise. She had never imagined she could learn something so seemingly impossible. Each small accomplishment felt like a victory over the timid woman she had been in Boston. The Henderson family had visited twice, and Eleanor had quickly become friends with their daughters, Mary, Susan, and Catherine. The girls were delighted to have another young woman nearby and peppered her with questions about Eastern fashions and city life. "You must think we're terribly backward out here," Mary Henderson had said during their second visit. "Not at all," Eleanor replied honestly. "You have freedoms I never dreamed of in Boston. You can ride wherever you please, speak your minds, and help run your family's ranch. I envy you that." Thomas overheard this conversation from where he sat discussing cattle prices with Jim Henderson. He smiled, pleased to hear Eleanor beginning to see the advantages of frontier life. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Eleanor. In the evenings, she and Thomas would sit on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the peace. She had begun painting during the long afternoon hours, and Thomas always showed genuine interest in her work. "You've captured something I see every day but never really noticed," he said, examining her painting of the morning mist rising from the creek. "The way the light filters through the cottonwood trees. It's like you see things differently than other people." "I think everyone sees things differently," Eleanor replied. "We just don't always know how to show others what we see." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I've never thought about it that way, but you're right. I see this land as possibility, as a place where a person can build something lasting. But you see the beauty in the small moments." These conversations revealed new depths to Thomas that even his letters hadn't shown. He was not just the practical rancher she had expected, but a man who thought deeply about life and wasn't afraid to share his thoughts with her. However, not everything was perfect. Eleanor struggled with some aspects of ranch life that she hadn't anticipated. The isolation sometimes felt overwhelming, especially when Thomas had to ride out to check on distant cattle and wouldn't return until evening. The physical demands of frontier life left her exhausted by the end of each day, and despite Thomas's kindness, she sometimes felt like she was playing a part rather than being herself. These feelings came to a head during her second week, when a sudden spring storm trapped them in the house for 2 days. The rain pounded against the windows and the wind howled through the valley with a ferocity that frightened Eleanor. "Does it always storm like this?" she asked, jumping as thunder crashed overhead. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "The weather out here can be harsh. But look, it's already starting to clear." He was right. By the second evening, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and green. But the experience had shaken Eleanor more than she wanted to admit. That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas noticed her unusual quietness. "Eleanor," he said gently, "what's troubling you? And please don't say nothing. I've come to know you well enough to see when something's wrong." Eleanor stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "I'm frightened," she said finally. "Not of you, but of all of this. The vastness, the isolation, the unpredictability. In Boston, I knew what to expect each day. Here I feel so small and unprepared." Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "Those are fair concerns. I've lived here so long I forget how overwhelming it can seem to someone new. I don't want to disappoint you," Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so kind, so patient. But what if I'm not strong enough for this life? What if I can't become the kind of woman you need?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor feared she had confirmed his worst doubts about her. But when he finally spoke, his voice was warm and reassuring. "Eleanor, look at me. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "You don't need to become anyone other than who you are. The woman who painted that beautiful picture of the creek, who learned to ride Star in 5 days, who asked me thoughtful questions about my dreams for this ranch. That woman is exactly who I hoped you would be. But what if the loneliness becomes too much? What if I can't handle the next storm or the one after that?" Thomas stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. "I won't lie to you. There will be hard times. Storms, harsh winters, moments when the nearest neighbor feels too far away. But Eleanor, you wouldn't be facing them alone. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Sharing the burdens as well as the joys?" He turned back to her. "And I think you're stronger than you know. You left everything familiar to come here. You've adapted to a completely different way of life in just 2 weeks. You've brought light and laughter to this house in ways I never imagined. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "In Boston, I felt like I was disappearing, becoming smaller every day. Here I feel like I'm discovering parts of myself I never knew existed, but it's frightening to change so much." "Change can be frightening," Thomas agreed, returning to his chair. "But it can also be wonderful. You've changed me too, Eleanor. This house feels alive now in ways it never did when I was alone. I find myself seeing things through your eyes, noticing beauty I used to overlook." They talked long into the night, sharing fears and dreams and hopes they had never put into words before. Eleanor told Thomas about her father's death and the helplessness she had felt watching everything familiar slip away. Thomas spoke of the loneliness that had driven him to write to Mr. Jameson, and his fear that he had become too set in his ways to be a good husband. "I kept thinking," Thomas said, "what if she finds me boring? What if ranch life isn't enough for someone who's seen the world?" "I haven't seen much of the world," Eleanor laughed softly. "Just Boston, and not even the exciting parts of Boston. But you have books and ideas and dreams. You paint pictures that make me see my own land differently. That's a kind of worldliness that has nothing to do with how many places you've been." As the fire died down to glowing embers, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, but it was no longer the overwhelming terror that had gripped her during the storm. Instead, it had become something more manageable, a natural nervousness about the unknown that felt balanced by growing confidence in herself and in Thomas. "I think I'd like to stay," she said quietly, "not just for the 3 months we agreed on, but permanently, if you still want me to." Thomas's smile was brighter than the firelight. "Eleanor Whitmore, I can't think of anything I want more." Outside, the wind had gentled to a whisper, and the stars shone with a brilliance that could only be seen in the vast Montana sky. Inside, 2 people who had started as strangers were discovering that sometimes the best things in life come from taking the greatest risks. The morning after Eleanor agreed to stay brought unexpected challenges that would test their new commitment. Thomas was awakened before dawn by urgent pounding on the door. He quickly dressed and found Jim Henderson on the porch, his face grim with worry. "Thomas, we need your help," Jim said without preamble. "Some of our cattle got spooked in that storm and broke through the fence. They're scattered all over creation, and we need every rider we can get to round them up before they wander too far into the hills." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "Is everything all right?" "Cattle emergency," Thomas explained quickly. "I have to go help the Hendersons. I might be gone all day, maybe longer." Eleanor's first instinct was the familiar flutter of anxiety at being left alone in this vast country. But looking at Thomas's concerned face and Jim Henderson's obvious distress, she pushed her fears aside. "Go," she said firmly. "Do whatever needs to be done. I'll be fine here." Thomas paused, studying her face. "Are you certain? You don't have to prove anything to anyone." "I'm not trying to prove anything," Eleanor replied, surprised by her own calmness. "I'm just being practical. Your neighbors need help, and you're the kind of man who gives it. That's one of the things I've come to admire about you." After the men left, Eleanor found herself truly alone on the ranch for the first time. The silence was profound, broken only by the sounds of birds and the distant lowing of Thomas's cattle in the far pastures. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, she discovered a strange sense of peace in the solitude. She spent the morning painting at her easel, capturing the way the morning light turned the distant mountains gold. Around midday, she saddled Star, something Thomas had taught her just days before, and rode out to explore more of the ranch on her own. The feeling of independence was intoxicating. In Boston, She had never been anywhere without a chaperone or at least other people nearby. Here she could ride for miles in any direction and see nothing but open country and sky. It should have been frightening, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She was returning from her ride when she spotted a rider approaching fast across the pasture. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Mary Henderson, Jim's eldest daughter, riding hard toward the house. Eleanor dismounted quickly as Mary pulled up. Her horse lathered with sweat. "Eleanor, thank goodness you're here," Mary gasped. "There's been an accident. One of the men got kicked by a spooked steer. He's hurt bad and we need someone who knows about doctoring. Ma sent me to fetch Mrs. Campbell from town, but that's a 2-hour ride each way. Do you know anything about caring for injuries?" Eleanor's mind raced. She had helped her mother care for sick neighbors in Boston and had watched the doctor who treated her father, but she had never dealt with anything serious on her own. "I know some basic things," she said carefully. "But Mary, I'm not a doctor." "You're the closest thing we have right now," Mary replied urgently. "Will you come, please?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Of course. Let me get some supplies." She quickly gathered clean cloths, water, and some basic medicines Thomas kept in the house, then saddled Star again. The two women rode hard toward the Henderson ranch, where Eleanor could see a group of men gathered in the yard. The injured man was a young cowboy named Pete, who worked for several of the local ranchers. He had been kicked in the chest and leg by a frightened steer, and was conscious but in obvious pain. Eleanor knelt beside him, trying to remember everything she had learned about treating injuries. "Pete, can you tell me where it hurts most?" she asked gently. "My ribs," he gasped. "And my leg. I think something's broke." Eleanor carefully examined him, her hand steady despite her racing heart. His breathing was labored but not desperate, which she hoped meant his lungs weren't damaged. His leg was clearly broken below the knee, and she suspected he had cracked ribs as well. "We need to get him inside and make him more comfortable," she told the gathered men. "And someone needs to ride for the doctor, not just Mrs. Campbell." Working with Mary and Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor helped move Pete into the house and onto a bed. She splinted his broken leg using boards from the barn and strips of cloth. Remembering how she had seen it done years ago, she wrapped his ribs tightly to help with the pain and gave him small sips of whiskey to help him rest. "You have gentle hands, miss," Pete said weakly. "Thank you for helping me." Eleanor stayed with the injured man for hours, monitoring his condition and keeping him as comfortable as possible. When the doctor finally arrived from town, he examined her work and nodded approvingly. "You did exactly the right things," he told her. "This young man is lucky you were here. That splint is as good as any I could have set," and keeping him still prevented further injury. It was well past sunset when Thomas finally returned to his ranch, exhausted and covered in dust from the long day of chasing scattered cattle. He expected to find Eleanor waiting anxiously for his return, but instead found a note on the kitchen table explaining where she had gone. He immediately rode to the Henderson place, where he found Eleanor in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Henderson prepare a late supper for all the men who had helped with the cattle roundup. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that made his heart skip. "Thomas, how did the cattle drive go?" "We found most of them," he replied, but his attention was focused entirely on her. "I heard what you did today. Pete's singing your praises to anyone who will listen." Eleanor blushed. "I just did what anyone would do. Mary needed help, so I helped." "Not anyone," Thomas said quietly. "Not everyone would have had the courage or the skill to handle an emergency like that. Jim told me you took charge like you'd been doing it all your life." Later, as they rode home together under a sky full of stars, Thomas was unusually quiet. Finally, Eleanor asked what was troubling him. "I've been thinking about what happened today," he said slowly. "When I left this morning, I was worried about leaving you alone. I thought you might be frightened or lonely or overwhelmed." "I was a little nervous at first," Eleanor admitted, "but then I realized that being alone here is different from being alone in Boston. There I felt isolated even when surrounded by people. Here I feel connected to something larger. The land, the community, even the silence itself." Thomas reined in his horse and Eleanor stopped beside him. In the moonlight, she could see the serious expression on his face. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. When I first wrote to Mr. Jameson, I thought I wanted a wife who would make my house comfortable and give me companionship. Someone quiet and gentle who wouldn't ask too much of me or expect too much from life out here." Eleanor felt a flutter of concern. "And now?" "Now I realize how wrong I was about what I needed. Today, when I heard how you handled that emergency, how you rode out alone and took care of Pete without hesitation, I understood something important. I don't want someone who will just fit into the life I've already built. I want someone who will help me build something bigger and better than either of us could create alone. He reached over and took her hand. You're not the quiet, timid woman I thought I was corresponding with. You're brave and capable and strong in ways I never expected. The question is, are you ready for a partnership with a man who's just beginning to understand what that really means? Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then up at his earnest face. Thomas, I came here thinking I was choosing between marriage and destitution. But that's not the choice at all, is it? I'm choosing between living a half-life in safety and living a full life with all its risks and possibilities. And what do you choose? Eleanor smiled, feeling more certain than she had ever felt about anything. I choose the full life. I choose you. I choose this place and this community and the chance to become someone I never imagined I could be. Thomas leaned over and kissed her gently, sealing the promise they were making to each other under the vast Montana sky. When do you want to get married? He asked softly. Soon, Eleanor replied. Very soon. I don't want to wait any longer to start our real life together. As they rode the rest of the way home, both of them felt the deep satisfaction of two people who had found not just love, but the perfect partner for the adventure of building a life together on the frontier. Eleanor had feared becoming a mail-order bride, but she had discovered instead that she was becoming exactly who she was meant to be. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood in front of the small mirror in her room, adjusting the cream-colored dress she had brought from Boston. It was her finest dress saved for special occasions, and today was certainly that. In just 2 hours, she would become Mrs. Thomas Brennan. The wedding would be simple, held at the Henderson Ranch so that Pete, who was still recovering from his injuries, could attend. The whole community had insisted on being part of the celebration, and Eleanor had been touched by how quickly these frontier families had accepted her as one of their own. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, expecting to see Mary Henderson, who had been helping with the preparations. Instead, Thomas stood in the doorway, looking handsome but nervous in his best suit. Thomas. You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony, Eleanor laughed. It's bad luck. I know, he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. But I had to talk to you first, alone. Eleanor's smile faded as she noticed his serious expression. Is something wrong? Thomas ran his hands through his carefully combed hair, destroying all of Mary's work. Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you weeks ago. Her heart began to race. After everything they had shared, what could he possibly need to confess now? When I first contacted Mr. Jameson, Thomas began, pacing the small room, I wasn't completely honest about my reasons. I told you I was lonely, and that was true. But there was more to it. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed, bracing herself for whatever was coming. My ranch has been successful, but I want to expand. There's a piece of land adjacent to mine that would double my grazing area and give me access to year-round water. The man who owns it, Samuel Morrison, is old and wants to sell, but he's particular about who he sells to. Thomas stopped pacing and looked directly at her. Morrison believes strongly that this country needs families, not just single men. He's made it clear that he'll only sell to a married man with prospects for children and community building. Without that land, my ranch will always be limited. Eleanor stared at him, trying to process what he was telling her. So you needed a wife to buy the land. I needed a wife to have the chance to buy the land, yes. But Eleanor, you have to believe me. That's not why I'm marrying you now. Somewhere between your first letter and this moment, everything changed. I fell in love with your mind, your spirit, your courage. If Morrison decided tomorrow that he wouldn't sell to me, I would still want to marry you. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her mind spinning. Finally, she looked up at him. Is there anything else I should know before we exchange vows? Any other practical reasons why Thomas Brennan needs a wife? Thomas knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. Nothing. I swear to you, Eleanor, there's nothing else. I just couldn't start our marriage with any secrets between us, even if it meant risking everything. Eleanor studied his face, seeing the fear and hope warring in his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, she began to laugh. What's so funny? Thomas asked, looking bewildered. Don't you see the irony? I came here as a mail-order bride, terrified that I was just a solution to someone's practical problem. And now I discover that's exactly what I was, at least initially. Thomas's face fell. Eleanor, I'm sorry. I know I should have told you sooner, but Thomas, stop. Eleanor placed her fingers over his lips. You're missing the point. Yes, you may have needed a wife for practical reasons, but I needed a husband for practical reasons too. I was facing destitution. We both entered this arrangement for survival. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rolling hills that had become so dear to her. But look what we found instead. We found partnership, respect, love. We found that we could build something together that neither of us could build alone. Thomas rose and came to stand behind her. So you're not angry? Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Angry? Thomas, you've given me everything I never dared to dream of. A home, a purpose, a man who values my thoughts and opinions, a place where I can grow into who I'm meant to be. Why would I be angry that practical necessity brought us together? Sometimes the most practical thing is also the most miraculous. She reached up and smoothed his disheveled hair. Besides, if you get that land, it means our children will have an even better inheritance. That seems like a good thing to me. Our children? Thomas asked softly. Well, I assume that's part of your expansion plans, Eleanor said with a shy smile. Unless you're planning to run all that extra cattle by yourself? Thomas laughed and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small room. Eleanor Whitmore, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Soon to be Eleanor Brennan, she corrected, straightening his hair again. And you'd better get out of here before Mary comes looking for you. She's been very specific about the proper way to conduct a wedding. An hour later, Eleanor stood in the Hendersons' front yard, surrounded by the entire community. The preacher, who had ridden 20 miles to perform the ceremony, opened his well-worn Bible and began to speak about the sacred bond of marriage. But Eleanor barely heard his words. She was too busy marveling at the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman with no choices. Today, she was a bride by choice, marrying a man she loved and respected, surrounded by friends who had become family. When Thomas slipped the simple gold band on her finger, she looked into his eyes and saw her own joy reflected there. They had both gotten much more than they had bargained for. You may kiss the bride, the preacher announced, and Thomas did, to the cheers and applause of their neighbors. Later, as the celebration continued with music and dancing and more food than Eleanor had seen in months, she found herself standing apart for a moment, watching the scene with amazement. No regrets? Thomas asked, appearing at her side with 2 cups of punch. Eleanor took the cup and looked around at the laughing faces, the children playing tag between the tables, the elderly couples sharing memories and advice, the young families building their futures together. No regrets at all, she said firmly. I feared becoming a mail-order bride, but instead I became exactly who I was meant to be. And I found exactly the partner I needed for the life I want to live. As the sun set over the Montana territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Eleanor Brennan, no longer Whitmore, realized that sometimes the most frightening decisions lead to the most beautiful destinations. She had taken the greatest risk of her life, and it had given her everything she had ever truly wanted. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train just weeks ago had been replaced by a confident ranch wife, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. And judging by the way Thomas was looking at her, she suspected there would be many wonderful adventures indeed.